Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild och loggan till podden är gjord av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. Det här avsnittet ska handla om Lovecraft-kretsen medlemmen, författaren Donald Wandrei och till viss del om hans bror Howard Wandrei. Donald Wandrei föddes 1908 och dog 1987. Han var kanske mest känd för att han var en av H.P. Lovecrafts författarvänner som då går under namnet The Lovecraft Circle, och att han efter Lovecrafts död tillsammans med August Derleth bildade Arkham House förlag och var det första förlaget som gav ut Lovecraft i hårdpärmutgåvor och därmed satte bollen i rullning för hela Lovecrafts postyma framgång. Bröderna Wandrei är två författare jag knappt vet någonting om, förutom när jag forskade på Lovecraft så dyker deras namn upp igen och igen. Det var på Lovecraft-festivalen jag träffade och lärde känna Dwayne Olson, som är kanske den främsta Wandrei-kännaren. Han äger alltså rättigheterna till Howard Wandreis grejer och hjälper till att förvalta Donald Wandreis litterära arv. How did this interest in Donald Wandrei start?
Well, it actually began because I knew Donald Wandrei. Back in the 1980s, I was involved with a group called what was then called MinCon, and they used to have a fall convention that was run by a guy named Jack Kobless, who was a Lovecraft scholar. And I discovered them in 1986, and Jack lived just 2 blocks from me. And Don Wandrei and Carl Jacobi were both still alive in those days, and Jack knew them. So one night, I and Roger Gerberding went over and got to meet Don Wandrei at his home. And sometime after, I didn't get to know Don very well at that time because he died within a year of that. I was in contact with the neighbor's kids because the neighbor had kind of taken over the estate. And I was also a publisher at the time, with a press called Jwin's Press. And I also knew, of course, Philip Raymond and Dennis Weiler, who were just starting out with Verdogen and Bremer at that time. So what ended up happening is I discovered Don because I met him, and so I read him and I liked him, but very little of Don's stuff was available at that time. And after he passed away and there were no further impediments to getting Don Wandrei into print, I started to pursue the possibility of reprinting him, and Dennis and Philip were doing the same. They ended up getting the rights to Don Wandrei, and I ended up doing a deal with them where I would do Howard Wandrei instead, who was Donald's brother and also a significant writer, in my opinion. And so they published Colossus by Don Wandrei, which I did an afterword too. And when I shut down my press, I then moved all the Howard Wandrei stuff over to them as well. And of course, when Don passed away, when he was alive, he didn't want any of his stuff reprinted.
How come? Was he displeased with his own material?
It wasn't because he thought his material was bad. It was, I think he was mainly burned out by what had happened with him with Arkham House and with certain other fandoms. There were just a lot of people in the field he didn't trust. For instance, he had been friends with Kirby McCauley at one time. Kirby was a major, well, at the time Don knew him, Kirby was a nobody. But Kirby went to New York and became a very major agent, primarily on the strength of Stephen King. He had deals with Arkham House under the new regime, which Don was fighting with. And when Kirby sold a few things and started representing Arkham House, he broke ties. And there were a lot of things like that. There were also people out there that were trying to rip him off or rip other people off. And he just withdrew from the field and didn't really trust anyone in it if he hadn't known them for many, many years.
So, how was that first meeting with Don like?
There isn't, I guess I can tell the story. I mean, there isn't that much to tell, but it kind of sets the stage, I guess, for what Don was like in those days. Because Don lived in the house that his parents had lived in and that he'd grown up in. And it was chocked floor to ceiling with lots of stuff. I mean, thousands of books. There were manuscripts. There were Clark Ashton Smith sculptures on the mantle. There was a TV set in the living room that hadn't worked in 10 years. Don pretty much didn't throw anything out. He was living not quite as a hermit because he would wander out to local bookstores and things like that. But, he wasn't exactly keeping house. He wasn't exactly entertaining people. He'd only let people in who he knew who were friends of people he trusted. So when I went to visit him, Jack Koblis gave Roger and I a lot of advice of things not to say, things not to mention. Because while Wandrei was perfectly willing to talk about Lovecraft, for instance, he didn't like to be quizzed. If you started asking him questions, he'd get very defensive and clam up. So it was just kind of, you'd go in and you'd talk about small things, and he'd start wandering off talking about other things that were of more interest. I know when I was visiting him, I stepped on one landmine I didn't know about. I mentioned a guy named Jerry D. Laree, who was a bookseller, which got Don ranting for a while about booksellers who sent sticky labels to authors to sign so they could slap them in books and sell them as signed books. But otherwise, it was a nice meeting. But I was also warned things like, well, if he offers you candy, don't take it, because Don was very frugal, and he would buy candy when it was on sale, and it would often remain in his house for several years. So you didn't necessarily want to eat certain things that he put forward because it was probably stale. And he also, there were piles of mail, there were piles of magazines. I know some people have talked about how they'd go and visit Don and they'd see like an unopened package under a table, and it would have been something from Clark Ashton Smith, who'd been dead for 20 years. And Don would just go, oh yeah, it's a sculpture. Because Don had a number of those sculptures he'd bought from Clark over the years. And I don't really know that there's much more to say from that meeting. At one point, he did start talking about Howard Wandrei artwork, because his brother was also an artist. And he was signing a book of his collected poems that had Howard Wandrei illos. And he turned to the one of the water nymph, and he started describing it to us, and how the original was in this beautiful aqua blue, and how striking it was. Which it was. I now actually own that piece of art. But at the time, pretty much no one ever saw Howard Wandrei art because, again, it was in the house. Don would occasionally bring it down and show it to somebody, or show a piece or two, but he pretty much never let anyone upstairs, so it would only be if he brought something down to show off. So in any event, getting back to the house, the house was loaded with material. And there were 2 estate sales, which unfortunately I didn't know about. The neighbors who were managing affairs, they knew of Donald's reticence to actually deal with a lot of people in the field. But they tried to do the best they could. They hired a reputable, estate agent to deal with things. They hired what they thought was a reputable bookseller to sell off the library and deal with other things. Unfortunately, the bookseller didn't know what he was doing, and neither did the estate agents. And one day, another old friend of Don's, who was a bookseller, came by the house, and he saw a dumpster in front of it, and he noticed that among the things being thrown out were at least one set of unbound sheets for the shunned house. So he brought them up to the neighbor's house and advised them of how much that was worth, at which point the bookseller was fired and new people were brought in who did a much better job of handling them stuff. And those new people, they did a book catalog with a lot of the books, though a lot were already gone. They also sold off Don's manuscripts and Howard Wandrei's manuscripts. And they also placed a whole bunch of material in the Minnesota State Historical Society. Unfortunately, along the way, a lot of material had crept out. And there was, for instance, there was one case of a book auction in California that suddenly listed a whole lot of Don Wandrei correspondence, including letters from H.P. Lovecraft and from August Derleth and others, that they were auctioning off, which had apparently been taken from the estate without their knowledge. Their stories vary of how that material got out. It might have been stuff taken from dumpsters. It might have been stolen, but no one knows for sure. So some of that material did eventually get dispersed. Some of it, luckily, to university libraries where I was able to recollect a lot of it. It was one of those classic cases of an estate that was just, there was too much there in the hands of people who didn't know what they were dealing with.
How would you describe Donald Wandrei's work to someone who doesn't know?
He fits into several categories. Originally, he was primarily a poet, and he was very well recognized for that at the University of Minnesota when he went there. And it also led him into a correspondence with Clark Ashton Smith. And he had a style very similar to Smith's in certain ways, you know, not the modern style. Although he was familiar with the modern style, he would write sonnets and other rhyming poems. And there is a book of his poetry that has been collected, actually two now, although his body of work in that was not huge. He then started to write, primarily, I think, because of his connection to Lovecraft and weird fiction, his lifelong interest in weird fiction. He started to write tales for magazines like Weird Tales and Astounding. And his works for those fall into two categories. There are the early science fiction stories, which are very much dated for the most part. They're usually like mad scientist causes the end of the world type stories. And his horror fiction is much more, it has a Lovecraftian bent without actually being Cthulhu mythos. Which is to say, he had, unlike most of the writers who followed in Lovecraft's footsteps, he had a sense for the cosmic. He would do stories set against a background of the universe sometimes. Talking with Fritz Leiber about a year after Don Wandrei died, and Fritz lamenting that he and all of his friends and all the Lovecraft circle had actually looked to Don Wandrei on Lovecraft's death as the guy most likely to carry on the torch for that sort of fiction. Unfortunately for them, by then Don had moved on to other areas. Partly it was his involvement with Arkham House, but also his main paying work in the late 30s was writing mystery stories for Clues Detective. And his most effective creation there was a character named Ivy Frost.
Ivy Frost, is that another occult detective character? Like, you know, Blackwood's John Silence or William Hope Hodgson's Carnacki, the Ghost Finder stories?
Yes, he's not an occult detective, but he's basically a detective that does unsolvable weird mysteries. There's no supernatural elements in the Ivy Frost stories, but the setups are so bizarre that they are almost supernatural, or at least weird. In one story, for instance, he investigates a case where a statue seems to have dropped from the sky into the grounds of his property and shattered into pieces. Only it's not a statue, it was actually a human body that had been cryogenically frozen. And so he then has to investigate where this came from and how it got there and who the victim was. Then in World War II started, and he went off to war, and largely he wrote very, very little thereafter, only a handful of stories.
Could you recommend us some Donald Wandrei stories, some of his best stories?
I think The Red Brain is a good early example of that, where there's no human characters in the story at all. It's a story set at the end of the universe where all that's left is this cosmic dust is clogging everything, is a race of sentient, disembodied brains who basically breed a new brain, the red brain, that will be more intelligent than they are, and that being more intelligent, it will be able to solve the problem that they're in and maybe save the universe. Basically, at the end of the story, the red brain levers up and makes its pronouncement, and its pronouncement is of such that it kills everything around it. Because as the story ends, you know, they had bred the red brain, and I don't remember the exact quote here, but the red brain was mad. It's very much a dark, universe-ending, non-human-centered story. I don't know that it holds up that well to good reading, or to modern reading. it's a little flowery in the prose, as Don could be in some of those. His most famous story when he was alive was Colossus, or I should say in his prime, because that was a huge thing back in about 1934. And it's a science fiction story in which a guy jumps on a spaceship as the Earth is being destroyed, and he's got faster than light flight, and somehow his basically the size of his ship and himself grow as they pass through the universe, and they actually pop into a whole nother universe. They become too large for the universe itself and pop through. And that got a lot of attention back then. I highly recommend, his Ivy Frost stories are almost entirely wonderful. Among Donald's weird fiction, I would say a couple that stand out for me. The Eye and the Finger, which is just plain weird, with no explanation. It's a guy who's haunted by a disembodied eye and a disembodied finger that are just floating. There's a book a story called The Tree Men of Mubwa. That's M''BWA, which some see as vaguely Lovecraftian, which involves a character who's in Africa, who's investigating some sort of ancient god or holy place where if you go there and defile the place, you become rooted to the ground at that spot and basically become a tree. The Witchmakers is another one. And that's kind of weird for Don because the first half of it, or a good chunk of it, seems to be like an African adventure, only the main character falls a prey of two mad scientists who are experimenting with transferring consciousness from one creature into another. There's this amazingly and very amusing for Don section where he finds himself in the body of a panther in the Belgian Congo, and he's out terrorizing the Belgian soldiers, including by rigging up a way to fire a rifle at them, which, needless to say, panthers don't normally do that. So, Fire Creatures came as good. The Painted Mirror is one that was filmed as an episode of Night Gallery years and years ago. Although you wouldn't recognize it from the version that was filmed because there's no Zsa Zsa Gabor in the story. Yeah, and some of the creepy stuff is also done with vaguely science fictional elements. The Destroying Horde, again, starts with a mad scientist unleashing some horrible monsters on the world. Scientist Divides is similar. When the Fire Creatures Came is basically an alien invasion by fire creatures. He didn't write traditional horror. It tends, even his horror fiction tends to be cosmic in scope, rather than, say, August Derleth, who never quite got the cosmic thing down.
Could you give a little biography on Don Wandrei?
Okay, well, he started out, his background was definitely upper middle class. His father was a fairly big hotshot lawyer in St. Paul who worked for West Publishing. So they were financially comfortable, and they were artistic or at least supportive of arts. So when Donald Wandrei showed a knack for poetry, they encouraged him. When Howard Wandrei showed a knack for art, they encouraged him. The sister Jeanette doesn't seem to have been so inclined. But they also had enough money to go to the University of Minnesota, which at that time was, there was a very artsy group of people there, as there were at a lot of universities in the 1920s, who were very influenced by the decadence, among other things. And Don fit right in there, did pretty good as contributing to the local literary journals and things like that. After graduation, he went to New York, where he became an editor for a brief period. Then he went back to Minnesota, where he started working on his PhD, became more involved in the literary scene. But with the Great Depression, he moved back to New York and just concentrated on writing to make a living. And he was very successful at it, with Astounding, Weird Tales, Clues, and other magazines like that. He also tried playwriting. And of course, he was close friends with the Lovecraft circle. In fact, when he was still in college, he had hitchhiked out to stay with H.P. Lovecraft. And he'd spent a month with H.P. Lovecraft in Providence. He later went out to visit Clark Ashton Smith a couple of times. When he was in New York thereafter, he, of course, was friends with the Lovecraft circle. He would host parties for H.P. Lovecraft when he'd come into town.
Well, perhaps the most significant thing he did was to be the first to publish Lovecraft's work in hardcover.
Well, when Lovecraft died, that's when you had a real significant change in his life, because he realized that Lovecraft's work was all going to be lost unless something was done. So he and August Derleth got together, and with the help of what was some help from Barlow, but also with help from Annie Gamwell and the Lovecraft estate, they founded Arkham House. And they hadn't planned on doing that. They were actually just trying to sell a Lovecraft collection to major publishers. And they submitted to at least 3 publishers that I know of, and I think that's all. And they had ins there, but even knowing people in those particular publishing houses, they couldn't get Lovecraft published. So they eventually decided to do it on their own. Now, Wandrei had published a book prior to that, when he was still in college, with some of his fellow students, including Harrison Salisbury, who later won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting. He had also financed a Sandalwood, a book by Clark Ashton Smith. So he knew something about the business, and August Derleth was building his house, so he would have a nice base of operations to sell books out of. And they started putting it together, and Wandrei at this time was also collecting all of H.P. Lovecraft's correspondence. He was writing to anyone who corresponded with Lovecraft saying, "Send me HPL's letters, we'll transcribe them and get them back to you." And he was paying for that out of his own pocket, by the way. And then, while we get back to Ivy Frost, Clues Detective and his, just to Ivy Frost's successor, Cyrus North, Don was making money producing those stories for Clues Detective. When Clues went through an upheaval and fired a bunch of their editors and changed what they were doing, and so he lost his financial markets. So the half of the money he was supposed to put up to found Arkham House was no longer there. Derleth ended up mortgaging his house in order to get the book printed. Don eventually did buy a bunch of books from him and provide other financial support. But contrary to what one might think today, it didn't go very well for the early Arkham House. They had published 1,000 copies, and after a year they'd sold maybe 500 of them. And even some of Lovecraft's old friends weren't willing to pay $5 for a book, Frank Long being a prime example. So Derleth was getting despondent. He was ready to actually remainder all the books they had left and close up shop. And Don stepped in, bought a bunch of books and loaned him money and kept the thing going. Which then, of course, led them to publishing other old people they knew, Frank Belknap Long, Don Wandrei himself, Clark Ashton Smith, Ray Bradbury, who was someone much younger who they'd only become acquainted with after Lovecraft's death, Fritz Leiber, who was a Lovecraft correspondent. And so, founding Arkham House was one of the key things that even if Don had never written, he'd be important for that. Unfortunately, jumping ahead a couple of decades, Arkham House eventually did find success, though it never really started making money until the 60s. Because that's when Lovecraft started becoming more known. They were able to sell paperback rights. They were able to get some movies made. But in 1972, August Derleth passed away. And when he did, Don Wandrei was supposed to take over the company and just kind of get through their backlog and decide what to do next. And for a while, that's the way it sat. For about a year, Don was technically the head of Arkham House and was going to buy the company outright, as was stipulated in Derleth's will. Well, unfortunately, a lawyer stepped in, got himself involved, Don Wandrei decided that the lawyer was ripping the estate off and he wanted more money to go to the children of August Derleth. So he ended up suing the Derleth estate for control of the company. And the litigation dragged on for 15 years before they finally reached an out-of-court settlement. And that lawsuit was actually mostly over Lovecraft copyrights. So at the end of it, Don, got a big financial settlement, but unfortunately he also, how can I put this? It basically drained him of any interest in the field from heading forward. And of course, it also cost him probably a good $150,000, $200,000 in legal bills in the meantime, plus lots of aggravation.
So how did Donald first get in contact with H.P. Lovecraft?
As I recall, and I haven't boned up on this, it's been a few years, but as I recall, Wandrei discovered Lovecraft in Weird Tales and started corresponding with him by writing a fan letter to the magazine. And that led to a correspondence, which then led Wandrei, being a guy who liked to travel, it led Wandrei to hitchhike out to Providence and meet Lovecraft for the first time. And he took a room at 10 Barnes where Lovecraft was living and stayed with him for a month. And after that, they were obviously very close. He was kind of Lovecraft's young acolyte, as Barlow later would be, or as Long had been. But later, as Wandrei got more active in writing and also in partying in New York, he had less and less contact with H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft continued to write. He continued to be a great correspondent all his life, but Don kind of trailed off because he was too busy with life to really, spend a lot of time writing long letters to HPL. And you can see that if you read the correspondence, it's kind of equal in its first half, and then as it goes on, it's more and more long Lovecraft letters and just small snippets from Wandrei, and only on occasion. And, in fairness, I think that's one of the reasons for the friction that later happened between Wandrei and Barlow. Because Barlow was just a young kid who did have that energy and that enthusiasm and didn't have those distractions. So Lovecraft, over those last few years, became a lot closer to Barlow. And I think in retrospect, Wandrei became a bit jealous of that. I should add, he had reasons to dislike Barlow before that, because there'd been a deal arranged via Lovecraft where Barlow was supposed to take photos of some Howard Wandrei art for possible publication. And Howard Wandrei, through Don, had sent a bunch of stuff, but then it didn't get returned. I mean, it eventually did, but it dragged out, and it left both Wandreis very suspicious of Barlow, because they didn't find him dependable. And of course that added then to the problem when Barlow was named executor. It's like, one, he was a young kid who didn't know anyone in the business, and two, he had a reputation for being kind of flighty and undependable. So they really felt that if Lovecraft was going to survive as a literary figure, that something needed to be done to get Lovecraft published by real publishers and in real books, rather than just in small press publications, the way Barlow. And that was Barlow's experience up to that point. And of course, things got even nastier after that, as a lot of people know. Both Wandreis, but especially Don, were very hostile to Barlow. Now, Howard Wandrei was in New York at the time Lovecraft died, and neither Donald nor August Derleth were. So he'd actually hosted Barlow at a party. He'd had some dealings with Barlow firsthand as Barlow was on his way to Providence. But he didn't much like Barlow. Don Wandrei hated him and thought he was going to ruin the estate. Don in particular did some nasty stuff towards Barlow. And it fell to August Derleth to come in and patch up the problems between Wandrei, Derleth, Barlow, and Annie Gamwell, Lovecraft's heir. Somewhat after this, after Derleth and Wandrei, with Barlow's permission, are shopping the Lovecraft volume the outsider around. Barlow sent a friend of his. I believe it was Gru Beck, or it could have been Claire Beck. It was one of the Beck brothers from California. And Beck stopped in New York. There was a party held that he was invited to. But Beck was also a young kid like Barlow, and he didn't tell anybody what he was actually up to. Because what he was actually up to is he was on his way to Providence to take books and other things out of Lovecraft's library at Barlow's instructions. The problem was that Don Wandrei and August Derleth were both coming into New York on their way to Providence, and when they got to Providence to begin working with Gamwell on assembling what was left, they discovered that a whole bunch of stuff had been taken, and they assumed that Barlow and the Becks had basically stolen it from the estate rather than selling it to the benefit of the aunts. So Don Wandrei wrote to many people condemning Barlow for that, including to Clark Ashton Smith, who had a project going with the Beck brothers. With, I think it was the Futile Press was what they were publishing as. And Smith, taking Don Wandrei's word for it, broke all contact with the Becks as a result. They later made up, but it really ruined fandom for both the Becks and for Barlow. As I said, Derleth stepped in. He kind of tamped down things. Derleth actually developed a decent working relationship with Barlow, but Barlow and Wandrei were not on speaking terms. And the arrangement for how things were done with Lovecraft at that time was that there were basically three people making the decisions on behalf of the estate and for the benefit of the estate. One was Barlow, and the other two were Derleth and Wandrei. And what it really came down to was Derleth and Wandrei making the decisions because they could outvote Barlow 2-1. One example of that, and I think overall Wandrei and Derleth were right in most of their decisions that they made at that time, but there is one exception to that kind of shows it, is that someone, because of the letters that had been deposited at John Library, a grad student had put together a thesis that he wanted to get published on H.P. Lovecraft based on the letters that were available. And Barlow was all for it. He passed it on to Derleth. Derleth wasn't so sure. He talked to Wandrei. Wandrei was dead against it. And Derleth and Wandrei in combination were then able to squash publication, just because they were not going to allow access to that material. And of course, this brings us into the whole area of Lovecraft copyrights, which gets even more complicated. Derleth and Wandrei, they worked under permission of Annie Gamwell until Annie Gamwell died. When Gamwell died, she passed all of her possessions onto, which would include, although it's not included in any of the contemporary documents, it would have included her control of Lovecraft copyrights, would have passed to Morrish and Lewis, who were two other aunts of HPL. Wandrei and Derleth at this point, they're actively agenting for Lovecraft and the Lovecraft estate, and they wanted to lock down rights so that they could be seen to do it if anyone challenged them. And Lewis and Morrish wrote a short document which later came to be known as the Lewis-Morrish Bequest. It gave Donald Wandrei and August Derleth rights to sell rights to H.P. Lovecraft and basically to publish or to do whatever they wished with them. It wasn't a proper legal document, but it was pretty good for what was necessary at the time. It later became a key document in the fight between Wandrei and the Derleth estate over control of Lovecraft copyrights. Now, a lot of people, up until I unearthed the actual document in the legal files, would actually say that didn't exist and that Derleth had just made it up. But in fact, it had. And it did pass to Derleth and Wandrei control of where Lovecraft was being published and how it was being published, and gave them the power to collect monies. Now, Barlow, throughout this, he was more involved than a lot of people think. In spite of the fact that he couldn't get along with Don Wandrei, he helped to assemble those early Lovecraft collections. He provided a lot of the typescripts. He did a lot of the typing himself. He didn't get the credit he deserved because Don Wandrei refused to let Barlow's name appear, as like a thank you or anything, because the feud was that intense between them. But Barlow continued working with Derleth throughout. In fact, I've seen, beyond the letters that are available at the Wisconsin Historical Society, there is a whole bunch of other letters that were recently unearthed where throughout he continues to say, he complains about Don Wandrei cutting him out, but he says, yeah, I'm fine with you, Augie, you're doing a good job, and if anyone asks, just tell them you have my backing 100%. And he says that in multiple letters. So Derleth somehow managed to walk that tightrope between Wandrei and Barlow. And in fact, so much so that when Barlow passed away down in Mexico, Derleth then also had a long correspondence with Barlow's mother. And he actually purchased a lot of Barlow's possessions from Barlow's mother in the aftermath of his death.
Well, one of the most famous things is Lovecraft's death diary that Barlow had, and it's today perhaps the most famous lost item of Lovecraft's possessions. I even did a story, The Creation of the Necronomicon, playing with the idea that the secrets of the Necronomicon was written down in that book in the death diary. Lovecraft's so-called death diary was then lost in Mexico when Barlow committed suicide.
Now that was something Barlow definitely had, because, well, and actually it cycles back to an earlier question about why people didn't like Barlow. Barlow was not well socialized, is a good way to put it. And when he was in New York visiting with the Wandreis and with Howard Wandrei and others, he was carrying that death diary around with him and reading it out loud. He would just pull it out of his pocket and read, and people found it really morbid and really creepy. So that was another strike against Barlow, is, that he seemed so focused on that rather than other things.
Yeah, a lot of stuff that Barlow had was scattered all over the place and turned up in strange places, or so I've been told.
And there was I remember, it's probably 20 years ago now, but I've been around long enough, I remember these things, when a manuscript for a long Lovecraft story, original manuscript version had turned up, I think in Hawaii, of all places. And that was, again, something that Barlow had. Well, and of course that brings up another problem with Barlow, is Barlow during this period was moving all over the place. He lived in Kansas City for a while, he was in California for a while. Often, if you read his letters to August Derleth saying, well, we really need this story or that story, and Barlow is having to write back and say, well, that's in storage in Kansas City, and I won't be able to get to it until I pass through there next month. So it created problems.
Well, Donald Wandrei is also famous for being the guy who met all of the three famous writers, H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, and Robert E. Howard.
Yeah, he did meet with them all. One thing I will share is, do you remember, was it Helen Sully or Genevieve Sully that was the daughter of a friend of Clark Ashton Smith?
It was Helen Sully.
Okay, Helen was the one who traveled, who got to meet all these people, too. She made a trip west. She visited New York, where she spent a lot of time with both Don Wandrei and Frank Belknap Long. She then traveled on to Providence to meet Lovecraft, and there was that famous story of her sitting in the graveyard at St. John's Churchyard, and Lovecraft telling spooky stories and actually frightening her so much she ran out of the graveyard. Later, it turns out, Don and Helen actually had a thing going for a while, and Frank Long was also chasing after Helen. So I know Don eventually, one of the reasons for one of his visits out to Clark Ashton Smith, quite frankly, was to spend some time with Helen out in California. It didn't work out, but, so it goes. Don himself in New York, the Lovecraft group was very much a group of intellectual talk. Don Wandrei and Howard Wandrei's primary social group in New York and elsewhere were somewhat less intellectual. I mean, they were intellectual, but they also were big into drinking and carousing. So, a lot of the stories about the Wandreis, and there's not that many about Don, basically involve New York parties, because they were pretty much every weekend was an ongoing party at this person or that person's place. H.P. Lovecraft would get drawn into that. You know, while Lovecraft didn't drink, when he was in New York, there would always be either Howard or Don Wandrei or Frank Long hosting a party in his honor. And he would get to, you know, sit and tell stories and just amaze everyone.
Maybe we should talk a little bit about his brother, Howard Wandrei. Do you have any stories about him?
In the early 40s, when Boris Karloff was appearing in Arsenic and Old Lace on Broadway, Howard Wandrei was still working for the Trojan Culture publishing group in the Spiceys, and they were, besides Superman, they were trying to get into other radio plays. And Howard Wandrei was picked as one of the staff writers to do this radio program. Unfortunately, I'm blanking on the name of the program now. And the idea behind the program was to sell original radio plays of a half hour in length in syndication, and they would all be hosted by Boris Karloff. So Howard Wandrei went into these meetings, and they were kicking around ideas of stories to be adapted, and Howard Wandrei said, hey, why don't we do some H.P. Lovecraft stories? And everyone looked at him like, what are you talking about? You know, they had no idea who Lovecraft was, because, of course, Lovecraft had died just a few years before. And so Howard Wandrei actually loaned his copy of The Outsider to Karloff's agent. So it was actually Howard Wandrei who essentially turned Boris Karloff on to H.P. Lovecraft. The two Wandrei brothers are interesting because Howard Wandrei was very open. If you ever get a chance to read any of Howard Wandrei's letters to, say, August Derleth, or even to his father, he talks about all sorts of stuff. And sometimes he talks about stuff that normal people will not talk about in letters, including muggings, attempted back alley abortions, various drinking stories. Don, and also relationship stories. Don Wandrei never talked about his personal life. So the only thing we really know about his visits to Lovecraft are what he would have put into letters or in pieces he wrote afterwards. You know, he was very circumspect. Same with his visits to Clark Ashton Smith and elsewhere. He never talked about that stuff. He never talked about his past relationships, though he had several, you know, with various women over the years. One of whom was actually a Hollywood actress named Dorothy Hart. Getting a biography on Don is really difficult. Whereas if you read Howard Wandrei, and Howard Wandrei also kept a diary for portions of his life, you can go in and you can get a really full picture of what his life was like, at least at various points. You know, because he goes into great detail and says exactly what's on his mind. I mean, he tells a story, for instance, I hate to bring this up in a podcast with a Swedish interviewer, but one of the things that gets brought up in a Howard Wandrei letter is Frank Belknap Long coming by his house right after the Nazis had invaded Norway. And Frank Long was a lifelong, communist. Actually, he was probably a Stalinist. And this was during the time of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. So Long was just elated that the Nazis had invaded Norway. And Howard Wandrei was so disgusted he threw him out of the apartment. You know, that's not the normal stuff that gets related, but Howard's letters are full of that sort of thing, including various marital problems and fights he's had with his wife, and also some drinking binges. So it's night and day following the two. Howard was a younger brother, and he made some major mistakes when he was young, in that he had actually been the head of a juvenile burglary ring, which landed him in prison for a couple of years. He got better after that, but if you read like Howard Wandrei's mystery stories, he's really good at getting into the seedy underside of life. I think even a little better than Don is in that regard. But he didn't have the cosmic scope that Don had. You know, they had a very troubled relationship. At times they were very simpatico and worked together, and at other times they were fighting like cats and dogs. They roomed together obviously in Minnesota in their youth, and also later on when Howard, well, I guess I should give some biography on Howard. After prison, Howard finished his degree at the U. He married eventually a woman who had been an old girlfriend of Don's. He was already at that time living in New York, and he'd given up art, more or less, to pursue a career as a fictioneer. And he made a decent living at it. He sold the Black Mask and Detective Fiction Weekly, but he did everything under pseudonym. Very few stories under his own name. And at various points during their relationship, like I said, at various times they got along, other times they fought like cats and dogs. There were periods when they didn't even speak to each other or even physically assaulted each other. Howard, eventually his marriage collapsed. He moved back to Minnesota in 45, I believe it was, and eventually died partly of cirrhosis of the liver in 1956. And during those last troubled years, there was a lot of friction between he and Don, although there were also moments of collaboration. I mean, they had, when Don was living in Hollywood trying his hand at script writing, he and Don had a series of letters that they exchanged, which Don later announced he was going to publish through Arkham House as The Circle of Pyramids. Now, it's not really publishable as it is, but what it was their correspondence during a one-year period. And it covered their views on artistic creation, and also covered a lot of people they knew and a lot of the history they'd covered. He passed away in 56, and he was forgotten. Partly because he wrote under pseudonym and never had a book published, even though August Derleth wanted to publish him in book form. And also because a lot of the markets he wrote for were things like the spicy pulps. And that was material that was run by a shady company that worked under various names, and which eventually partially morphed into DC Comics. In fact, Howard Wandrei at one time was actually asked for the Superman radio program in its early days. And he did collaborate with Don, I should add, on one stage play, which was never produced. It's called Come to Life, and basically it's a light comedy with some supernatural elements, and it involves, the basic plot is of a department store mannequin who comes to life and creates all sorts of havoc in the love lives of the other characters.
Could you talk a little bit about Don's later life and what happened?
Don remained sharp. He remained healthy, although he did suffer a very brutal beating in the course of a burglary at one point and was hospitalized for a time. But, he was financially secure. His mother and his sister had died also back about 1972, at the same time Derleth had. His brother Howard had died in 1956. So he was alone in the big old house. Outside of neighborhood connections, he basically had no role in anything. He did get into a feud with the early World Fantasy conventions, but that was tied to his feud with Arkham House because Kirby McCauley was involved in that. And he basically lived like a retiree and, as I said, like a recluse in many respects. So he was totally removed from the field. He wasn't ailing. He was just not interested in venturing out, I guess is the best way to put it. When he did mail things out to people at that point, there would be a lot of ranting about Arkham House, about the World Fantasy Convention, but he never explained what was actually going on. So he kind of developed a reputation as a crank and as a tough person to deal with. He did definitely have a paranoid streak, though. As I said, if you went to visit him, you didn't want to ask questions or look around too much, lest he think you were spying on him.
There's this famous controversy between Don and the World Fantasy Convention. I don't know if this is true, but apparently he was offered the World Fantasy Convention's prize, and he refused to accept it because the statue was a caricature of the face of his old friend H.P. Lovecraft, and he was very upset about that.
The World Fantasy Con was founded by a bunch of people, including, I'm going to miss a few, but David Hartwell, Kirby McCauley, Don Grant, Stu Schiff was involved there, Dwayne Olson was involved. But he had a huge feud going with Kirby McCauley, because Kirby McCauley was the guy who had basically, in his mind, gone over to the enemy by working with Arkham, and who had also represented himself as Don's agent in selling a story he hadn't approved. So he had a major problem with Kirby McCauley, and he saw the World Fantasy Con itself as a way for people like McCauley to simply cash in on the experiences of an older generation of writers. So that was the root cause of the feud. It wasn't the statuette, it was the convention itself.
Ja, det var allt för den här gången. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller. Musiken är skapad av Testbild. Hej då.